All right, welcome to tonight's second episode of the Pint of Science online festival. We heard yesterday was a very nice episode on love in times of COVID. And tonight we're going to talk about a very different topic. We're going to talk about ADHD. And I have three guests with me tonight, who I will introduce to you shortly. But first, we're talking about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And well, you might have heard of this. You might maybe know some people with ADHD. You might have ADHD yourself. And you might know that ADHD stands for individuals who have problems with attention and or hyperactivity or impulsivity. But today we're going to talk about everything you don't know yet about ADHD. And there's these three researchers here with me tonight who are investigating topics that, we don't usually associate with ADHD, but are actually very important for understanding ADHD. And they all work at the Radboud University Medical Center in Nijmegen. And they're my colleagues, so I'm very happy to have them on board today. What they will do, they will all give a short talk, a short summary of their research. And after we will start with one talk, and then afterwards you can ask that person the questions. We will start with Babette, and then with Mirjam, and then Mandy. So they give a short summary of their work, and then you can just ask them anything you want, any questions you have, anything that you didn't really understand from what they told you, or anything you want to know more. You can just type it in the chat or in the comments on YouTube or Facebook, and then we will ask them, and then we'll give you the answers to your questions. But before we start, I will already tell you two things that you might not know about ADHD. And one thing is that you have ADHD, but maybe many people also know ADD, attention deficit disorder. And this is often confusing because, are they the same or not? So ADD is a kind of a subtype of ADHD. So tonight when we talk about ADHD, I think in many cases we will also talk about ADD. You kind of mean them both, but they have different ways of expressing them. Some people have only the inattention problems, and others also have the hyperactivity problems. And then something else you might not know is that ADHD is not just something that occurs in young boys, but girls can have ADHD as well, and adults can also have ADHD as well. So more people might have ADHD and also longer in their life than you might usually think of. So that will also come back tonight, I think. But that's it for me from now. I'm going to listen to these great speakers. And let's start with Babette. Babette Jakobi is a PhD student in our group, and she will tell you all about her research on ADHD. Babette, the floor is yours.
Hi, I'm Babette. Yes, as Annette actually already nicely introduced, and I think probably all of you already know that ADHD is most commonly characterized by these two core symptoms, hyperactivity and inattention. So we probably all have the same picture in mind of someone like rocking on their chair in school, or like fidgeting legs, or also like someone just having problems with, sorry, I'm hearing my own echo. Also someone just having trouble with focusing on a specific task. But ADHD actually comprises much more than that. There's more impairments, but there's also more strengths, which is something I really want to point out today. It has only been actually in the last decades that researchers started to work closely together with patient organizations, and thus they also started to investigate problems that ADHD people brought up themselves. And one of these problems is actually, or one of these topics is actually emotional problems, because in children up to 50% and in adults up to 70% of people with ADHD actually do experience emotional problems, which is like emotional excitability, lability, frequent temper outbursts like reactive aggression, and also a low frustration tolerance. And as you can imagine, this is quite impairing. Like your family and friends are not going to love it if you have frequent temper outbursts. And you're going to have a really hard time at school and at work if you have a low frustration tolerance. So above these impairments actually of your social life and your work life, researchers have found out that emotional problems in ADHD are also associated with more contact with criminality, up to even more contact with suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So for us, it is really important actually to find out what drives these emotional problems in ADHD. Is this something that is inherent to ADHD or maybe to a subgroup of ADHD? As we heard, there's different subtypes also. What might be risk factors? And also, where exactly during emotion processing do these problems arise? And during my PhD, during the last year that I've been working here, I've actually been focusing on investigating these issues, especially on emotion regulation, so the formation of an appropriate emotional response. And I've been mostly looking at it from the brain perspective. So I want to know, what does the brain actually do while we're forming an emotional response? And for that, I'm actually giving you a very short and very simplified overview of how the brain works in this emotion regulation system. So there's two systems basically interacting with each other. The one thing is the limbic system. You might also know that already as like the fight or flight system. So this actually is responsible for an intrinsic emotional reactivity. So you're reacting to a stimulus with fear or with whatever. And then there's also, as in every good system, a control area, which is like the prefrontal cognitive control, which actually reappraises the situation. Maybe things like, oh, fight or flight might not be the right thing. Maybe we talk it out or something like that. And in healthy people, these two systems actually interact with each other. However, in studies with children with ADHD, researchers have found that the limbic system seems to be hyperactive. So these regions seem to react in a different way, the limbic system, but also the prefrontal cortical control areas. And importantly, there's also kind of less connectivity between this control mechanism and this intrinsic emotional reaction. So there seems to be less regulation in that sense. So what we see from this is actually that the brain in ADHD, and especially these emotion regulation systems, seem to act differently. What might cause that? Like one colleague of ours, Martine Hochmann, actually, she made a huge study with about 4,000 participants with and without ADHD. And she found that these areas, among with other areas, actually seem to be slightly smaller. And this effect was most pronounced in children with ADHD. She also found that this effect seemed to diminish. So these areas were smaller at the beginning, but throughout the development, they were growing into the right size or growing differently. Let's say they matured differently. So what we might think from that is actually that this kind of a developmental delay of our brain could actually make us more liable to experience emotional problems, because during adolescence, we all learn how to regulate our emotions and how to engage in social activities. So this developmental delay could actually propose a liability. However, most of these studies have only been actually conducted in children. As you know, this is like kind of a prejudicement that you always think ADHD is a children's disorder, but many adults with ADHD still have it. And as you saw in the first slide, that up to 70% also have these emotional problems. So for me, it was very important to also research the adult ADHD brain. And what I did there was actually in the impact study, I invited some adult people with and without ADHD, and I showed them emotional faces in the brain scanner. And I wanted to know, how does the brain actually react on that? And is that maybe associated with emotional problems, which I measured here with reactive aggressive behavior. And the first thing that we found was that also in our sample throughout ADHD, reactive aggression, so emotional problems, were more prevalent in the ADHD group than in the control group. And the other thing that is very important to me to point out today is that these emotional problems were actually associated only in the ADHD group with higher limbic activity, not in the control group. In the control group, we didn't find any such effects. And that actually shows me that these emotional problems are an integral part actually of the adult ADHD, and they are still actually related in the adult ADHD with the differential processing mechanism in the brain. Moreover, this mechanism actually seems to correlate with the hyperactive symptoms. So for me, it seems that it's really important for adults with ADHD to be recognized in a therapeutic and clinical context, as it is not today. But enough of all the negative parts, I would say. I'm talking about impairments and disabilities and problems. But there's actually also another way, like there's a way of looking at something that is different from normal that could also be positive. And I'm very, very happy actually to talk also for Martina today, who's investigating these positive sides of probably impairing disorder. So she's been working together with Impulse, with a patient organization, and they asked people what do they think are their strengths. And one of the most important things that people with ADHD actually named was their creativity. So Martina wanted to know, is there actually scientific evidence for that? And what she found was that ADHD, in fact, is associated with creative achievements in humor, writing, and in visual arts. And what I find very interesting and very nice, actually, that in our sample with the adults, we also found out that this creativity, also the more creative our adults were, the happier they actually reported about themselves. So it's kind of a nice way to also report what might come with the disorder that might be actually strengthening you, to use these strengths maybe to build up a better self-esteem and to lower the stigma also. So I'm very happy actually to talk about that side of research as well. And now I'm open to questions actually.
Thank you very much, Babette, for this very nice, other sides of ADHD, emotional problems, but also creative aspects, right? And I'm sure many people didn't know about these aspects of ADHD yet. So you can already see in the banner, don't hesitate to ask questions in the comments. We really welcome those questions, but maybe while people are thinking about what to ask you, I can start with a question. And maybe as a first, I also often get this question. So you make brain scans of people, right? And people are always very curious what you can see. You know, can you see their thoughts or can you see their emotions? Can you see from a brain scan whether someone has ADHD or has emotional problems, or maybe that person is creative?
No. That's very important actually to know that, from these brain scans, actually, between our brains, there's so much variability between each of our brains, actually, that you could not see any effect in a one-on-one comparison or even like in one person. These effects are only seen actually over a broad range of people, so over many people, and these effects are also very small. So if you have, for example, a higher limbic activity, there might also be people with ADHD that have lower activity. So just in the mean, we see these effects. So that's actually important to know.
Okay. Yeah, so they're too small to see between, like for one individual.
Yeah, because every single one of our brains is very different, so we couldn't see anything there.
Yeah. And do you know why emotional problems were always kind of discarded, like we're not part of the ADHD definition, if it's so prevalent?
They actually were in the 60s, and in the first descriptions of ADHD, they actually were part of the core symptoms. But with the third DSM that was actually coming out, there were only associated features. And I think that's also partly due to the fact that in children, it is not the most prevalent symptom. Not all of the children, but up to 50% of the children report these problems. So it is, or it seems to be, a subgroup of ADHD that also is the subgroup that seems to suffer longer from their impairments. That actually experiences these emotional problems. Not everybody has it, obviously. And as you know, ADHD is also a very heterogeneous disorder. So not everybody also has the hyperactive part or the inattentive part, as Ignacy also pointed out.
Yeah. And do they all have the creative part?
No. Actually, in this patient organization, there were also some other points that came up by people with ADHD, like their enthusiasm or their motivation. So this is not the only thing that people report that might be positive.
Yeah. But of course, there are some examples, right, of very creative people and successful people with ADHD who kind of manage their symptoms well enough and also manage to benefit from the positive aspects of their condition. Yeah. Thanks.
So
Looking, do we have any?
I was just going to add,
go ahead.
Maybe they can use their creative strengths to overcome their apparent weaknesses, right? So maybe they can themselves think of a creative way to deal with, I don't know, some impulsive aggression, or I don't know, something that is hard to control. You could think of ways that they can use this themselves in their therapies to make their own solutions for problems they experience in daily life, right?
Yeah.
Very nice research, Babette.
Thank you.
I don't think there's questions yet, at least as far as I can see, but maybe people need to process this a bit and think about. Let's check. Okay, let's move on to Mirjam. And then, but people, if they still have questions for Babette, you can always still ask them. So Mirjam is sitting here in her own private bar. As you can see. So she's one of the lucky people who had just built their own bar in their garage because, you have to do something during the lockdown. But next to building bars in her garage, Mirjam is also a postdoctoral researcher in Nijmegen. And she's looking at the gut microbiome, and she will tell you all about what the gut microbiome has to do with ADHD. So Mirjam, go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm here today to talk about the gut bacteria, and we work with Dr. Alejandro Vasquez, and we work with this group of young enthusiastic women, of which Babette just presented. So we look at bacterial DNA to understand the effect of the role that bacteria, that your gut bacteria, play in your emotions or in your cognitive performance. So we want to understand if there is a role for the gut bacteria in neurodevelopmental disorders such as ADHD. So we look at bacterial DNA, and we also work in the larger group of Professor Barbara Franke. And in this group, we look at human DNA. So from these two perspectives, we try to understand the host genetics, so that you carry yourself within you, and the DNA that your bacteria carry. We try to understand this role in ADHD in this case, and we do this, as was said, at the Radboud University Medical Center. And we are part also here in the Epigenetics Consortium. So you can see a couple of these people that are part of the Epigenetics Consortium here on this picture. So this is a European interdisciplinary consortium where we approach problematic behavior, to summarize it like this, and to understand this from genetic perspective, but also from more environmental perspective. For example, looking at diet. So that's a little bit about the setting in which we do our research. So as I said, today I'm going to tell you about, let me see how I can switch my screen, my slide. Yeah, so you still see my slides, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So today I'm going to tell you about the microbiome gut-brain axis. And so here you have your intestines, and a lot of microorganisms live there, and we study the gut bacteria. So that's one type of microorganisms that live in your gut. And actually you are outnumbered by the bacteria that live in your gut. You have about twice as many gut bacteria as you have cells in your body. So that's already quite an interesting fact to know about the gut microbiome. And we know that the gut bacteria are very important for our health, and are the most well-known role of the gut bacteria is to digest our food. And for example, the gut bacteria, they can digest complex fibers that we ourselves cannot digest. So this means that we have a symbiotic relation between our gut bacteria and ourselves. So we both benefit, both the bacteria and we benefit from this relation. So our gut bacteria are very important for our health, our immune functioning, for example, but also for our mental health. And that is what I want to talk about today. So this interaction between your gut bacteria and your brain, it goes both ways, and it goes through three main routes. So one of these is the vagus nerve, and that is depicted here. So I've highlighted this part. So from your brain, there is a very a wandering nerve. That's how it got its name, the wandering nerve, and it connects your organs. And in this case, I want to talk about the intestines. It connects your intestines with your brain. And for example, it passes signals on gut motility. So how busy your intestines are with digesting your food. It passes these types of signals to your brain. And this is relevant, for example, when you have to switch to a flight or fight mode, for example, then your intestines have to stop digesting. So these kind of signals on the state of your intestines are transferred through the vagus nerve. And in terms of ADHD, there are a couple of studies indicating that the vagus nerve and the connection between the intestines and your brain through the vagus nerve works differently or works less efficient. So we have some indications to that in that direction. Then there is this other pathway. This is the immune pathway. And actually the gut and the immune system, they work very closely together. So all the time they calibrate each other in daily life also. So a balanced gut microbiome is, for example, a diverse microbiome with many different types of bacteria. And if you have a balanced gut microbiome, oftentimes also your immune system works fine. But in case you have an unbalanced microbiome, so you have, for example, an overgrowth with a specific pathogenic bacteria, but also in more subtle differences or imbalances, you can sometimes see that the immune system is also dysfunctional. Now, in terms of ADHD, we know most about the dysfunction of the immune system based on epidemiological studies. So where we look at large groups of people with ADHD diagnosis and without ADHD diagnosis. And then what we see is that patients with ADHD more often also have a somatic diagnosis. So a diagnosis of dysfunctional immune or intestinal functions, such as irritable bowel disorder or other types of intestinal complaints. So this is an indication that ADHD is not only a state that is expressed through your behavior or in your brain, but that part of ADHD is also having an altered intestinal function and a dysregulated gut immune system. And then the last pathway that I want to highlight today is the neurometabolic pathway. So we know that the gut bacteria, they produce all kinds of metabolites or compounds, and they are very important for brain functioning. And I want to highlight one study that where this was schematically depicted. So what you can see here is to be representing the intestine. And here you can see the mucosal lining. So this is the intestinal barrier. So this is a slimy layer where gut bacteria, so the microbiome, they grow on this mucosal lining. And these bacteria, we know that they produce all kinds of compounds such as tryptophan, phenylalanine, and tyrosine. And these compounds then pass through the mucosal lining into your blood circulation. And there they can cross the blood-brain barrier and then enter your brain. And then in your brain, these compounds are critically converted to dopamine and noradrenaline. So this is important because dopamine and noradrenaline, we know that these are neurochemicals that are important for normal, healthy mental functioning and cognitive performance. And we know that the functioning of noradrenaline and dopamine in ADHD is different. So here you can see that although the gut and the brain actually they seem far apart, through these types of mechanisms they are actually quite closely connected. And here I just want to highlight this specific study where the gut microbiota, so the poo of the ADHD patients and control subjects were compared. And what was found is that ADHD patients had a higher amount of bifidobacteria, so one specific type of bacteria, in their gut. And then when we look closely more at the function of this bifidobacterium in the gut, what we know is that this bifidobacterium produces phenylalanine, which is a precursor which is converted in the brain to dopamine. So subjects in this study that had more bifidobacterium in their gut also showed altered brain functioning. So here we can see in one of the first pilot studies really that the gut bacteria are actually related to altered brain functioning. And this is one of the first studies that we want to use and replicate and extend to see if we can really find an established role for the gut microbiota in ADHD as part of the ADHD characteristics. And of course, then we want to see if there is a way to change this gut microbiota differences. So maybe we can treat this with diet. So that's what I wanted to highlight briefly for you guys. Do you have questions?
Thank you very much, Mirjam. I really like this slide. I hope my gut bacteria look like this happy bunch as well. Thank you. Yeah, so again, if people have questions, please ask them. And meanwhile, I will ask you almost the same question as Babette. So we cannot see from brain scans if someone has ADHD, but can we then maybe see it from their poop? Can we just diagnose people based on a poop sample?
Yeah, unfortunately not, or not yet. I would say so. The same argument goes that Babette mentioned for the brain scans. This also goes for your gut microbiota. So this is an ecosystem that is really variable between individuals, and the group differences. If you if you put ADHD patients on one pile and control subjects on another pile, these group differences are very, very small. So unfortunately, you cannot just yet send in a poop sample and your diagnosis will roll out. But we do hope in the end, in the future, that we may be able to give some kind of dietary advice based on subgroup or profiling based on your gut microbiota. But we are nowhere near that now, and it also remains to be seen whether we will even reach this stage.
Yeah. But then, so how does your research, how can it benefit people with ADHD? What do you mean to reach in the end by getting a better understanding of this?
So, for example, one study that we recently published with the group is a study where healthy subjects, so this was not done in ADHD subjects, but here healthy subjects, they underwent in the laboratory, so in a research institute, a stressor that was also increasing their cortisol levels. And these subjects also took probiotics for 1 month. And actually those subjects that used that probiotics, they were less affected by this stressor. So after the stressor, the subjects had to do a working memory task. So that you have to retain some items in your short-term memory for a period of time. And it is known that under stress, this is more difficult. So usually your performance under stress goes down on this type of working memory, on this type of short-term memory task. But we have seen that the probiotics actually helped in limiting this stress effect on your short-term memory. And then also we saw that there was an increase in one specific gut bacteria. So those subjects that after 1 month of probiotics had a larger increase in this specific gut bacteria, those were also the ones that benefited most from the probiotics on reducing the stress effect on their cognitive performance. So this is one indication that under specific circumstances, for example, if you are highly stressed, then, for example, probiotics can help you remedy or buffer against these effects of stress. And we can also think of ADHD, where maybe ADHD subjects can be helped in reducing their symptoms if they use probiotics maybe in their daily life, or maybe in periods that they are particularly are stressed, or they need to have some support. And within the consortium, the Epigenetics consortium, currently there are a couple of clinical trials running where we want to test in a randomized controlled manner. So using a control group and testing this in a blinded way, both for the researchers and for the participants, whether, for example, probiotics or multivitamins, whether this has a beneficial effect on the symptoms that ADHD patients experience.
Okay. Yeah, so the randomized controlled trials, that's like the golden standard, right? If you want to prove if something works, you give people a placebo or a probiotic, and then you see if there's a difference. And that's what you're investigating at the moment. So we don't know yet if this works for ADHD.
We don't know yet the results.
Yeah, but I do hear this has nothing to do with ADHD, but maybe if some students are listening that have exams coming up in a month, maybe they can start taking probiotics.
Well, you can always try it, but you cannot just assume that using probiotics will always be harmless. So if you have, for example, already an imbalanced gut microbiome, I would not just start using probiotics, but I would definitely ask your doctor or ask some guidance in this. So don't just go about and try anything out, but try to get some help where you can from a doctor or a dietitian. That's always better.
Yeah, that's good advice. Yeah.
Maybe also important to know is that diet also has a huge effect on the microbiome. It doesn't have to be probiotics. You're influencing your microbiome a lot with your lifestyle already. So a healthy lifestyle is probably always a good way.
Yes. It's always good to keep your gut bacteria in mind when you choose your food. So just try to eat like food rich in fibers and very diverse diet. So that's always good to take care of your of your gut bacteria.
Okay, and what can you eat to take good care of your gut bacteria? What do they like?
Well, they like complex fiber, so so they like whole grain food. I guess that's the correct term, and also legumes. So different types of beans. So you want to give your gut bacteria something to do. That's basically the take-home message. So if you eat crisps or something, these are all very processed food, and they basically already did the job for your gut bacteria. So that's not going to make them happy. Maybe it will make you happy on the short term. So you don't have to completely neglect yourself, but it's for your gut bacteria. It's always better to eat fibery diet.
Okay, well, now I see a lot of questions coming, and of course there's already one about beers, which I assume ales have more complex fibers than lagers. I'm not that much familiar, but do you know if there's a difference between different types of beer? Do your gut bacteria prefer one or the other?
Always have those very well. I'm not really an expert on that, but you have these really filtered types of beers, and I guess that there is less in there for your gut bacteria that is really dark, mushy, unfiltered. So you have a couple of these German unfiltered beers, right? Maybe Babette has something to say about this. So I guess that these do more for your gut bacteria than the filtered ones.
Babette, any German insights?
If only I knew.
Let's see. I see some other questions. How easy is it to modify the gut microbiome? So, how long does it remain?
Yeah, so that's always a very relevant question, and almost the holy grail, right? So in the adult microbiome, the adult human microbiome is quite hard to change because it is quite stable in itself. So it's an ecosystem, and so it has a homeostasis in itself, right? Still, it is possible to change it, but this would almost mean that you need this continuous altered input, because your gut bacteria, they grow on what you feed them, basically. So with your diet, you can definitely change your composition. But once you stop using that diet, then very likely your gut bacteria they go back to their old homeostasis or similar. So if you want a sustained different bacterial composition, you would likely have to continue that altered intake for a very long period of time, or maybe even permanent.
Okay, so you better choose something that you like if you want to improve your bacteria.
Yeah.
If you don't like the lagers, then don't drink them, even if it's good for you.
Yeah.
And another question I see from the same person is: good bacteria that we think are helpful, can they also be harmful? Like, can something be helpful for one individual and harmful for the other?
Yeah. Yes, this is the case, and that's also why I said that you should be careful in trying to experiment by yourself, because, well, I know for one that there was one study done using probiotics in a particular cancer patient group, but I have to know that these were very ill patients already. But in this study, we know for a fact that the probiotics did more harm in the patient group than the control, than the compound that was used as a control. And so this was very shocking, and of course this study was discontinued. But so this was done already in very sick patients, but it is an illustration that that we don't. It's not something that you can use because it will do no harm anyways. That is unfortunately not the case. In healthy individuals, I myself do not know of an example where probiotics did harm, but there may be some. So that's the answer I have for you at this moment.
Thanks. Yeah, so there's still a lot of research to do. I think you're not out of a job soon yet, Mirjam.
I hope not.
All right. I think we should move on to Mandy. Mandy is also a PhD student in our group, although she's currently in Lausanne, doing part of her research there. And she will tell us all about epigenetics, which is a very complex word, but she will tell us everything about it.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, I will also talk about ADHD. But first, I want to introduce another concept to you. And that's also basically the question, like we have the DNA, the code for life, and this DNA, the same code is in all our cells. But we have more than 200 different cells. So how can all these cells be different if they all have the same code? I cannot wait. But,
Can you change your slide?
Yes, wait, let's try again. Yes. So I have, for example, a heart and bones. And
we now can't see you yet.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, share again. Yes, so now you can see it, right?
Almost.
Yeah?
Yeah, and now we don't see the full screen yet.
No, not a full screen.
No.
This is, wait, okay.
This always happens, right? You test it 4 times, and then when it's live, it happens different.
Okay, let's try it like this. And now?
Lucky. 1 second. Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. So we had all these different cells with the same DNA code. So we can see it like this. I have a heart and I have bones in my body. And my heart contains heart cells and my bones contain bone cells. And they clearly look different and they have different functions because they have different proteins in the cell. And these proteins this DNA code contains the code to make these proteins, and it's the same. But there is something different in all these cells because there are chemical attachments on the DNA. So here it's in purple, a methyl group. We call this DNA methylation. And this DNA methylation regulates which proteins will be in which cells and thus what the function of that cell will be. So I would like to compare it with a factory. And since I really love to bake cakes and also to eat them, I will take you to a cake factory. And this cake factory makes cakes with candles. So your DNA code is a sort of factory. And this methylation that is attached to the DNA can be seen as a lever that regulates the amount of candles that are made for the cake. And the candles here can be compared with the proteins in the cells. So if there is not so much DNA methylation on the DNA, there will be a lot of candles made. But when there is a lot of DNA methylation, there will be less candles made. And this will result in either a cake with candles or a cake without candles. And now I think it becomes even more interesting when you consider that also our surroundings have effect on this DNA methylation. So far we made strawberry coated cakes, but this is only possible when there is strawberry season. When it's summer, there are a lot of strawberries, so we can make a strawberry coated cake. As soon as summer is over and there are not so many strawberries anymore, the factory has to adapt a little bit and have to start make chocolate coating cakes. And one of these environmental or surrounding factors in real life is smoking. We know that smoking influences our DNA methylation at very specific parts at the DNA. We also know quite well where in this DNA code these parts are. And if we would look at someone's DNA and sum up all the DNA methylation at this specific part, we can create a so-called DNA methylation smoking score. So we did that for individuals, participants that came into our lab, and we clearly see that the individuals that told us that they indeed smoke have a higher DNA methylation smoking score compared to the individuals that told us, no, I do not smoke. And I think this one data point is really interesting because this individual told us that he did not smoke, but he has a pretty high DNA methylation smoking score. This could mean that this participant lied to us, but it could also mean that it's a passive smoker, meaning that this individual itself does not smoke, but that people in his household do smoke. And so this can also affect your DNA methylation. So this DNA methylation can lead to diseases and disorders, and I investigate this for ADHD. And as already was mentioned quite often tonight, that ADHD is not only a childhood disorder, because the study we performed is that we asked children to come into our lab and we assess their ADHD symptoms. And then we asked them 9 years later, when these children were adults by then, to come back into our lab. And we assessed again their ADHD symptoms. And we could see that there were individuals that had ADHD during childhood, but and still when they were adults. So we call them persistent ADHD. Their symptoms persist during adulthood. But we also saw that there were individuals who had ADHD during childhood, but as soon as they were adults, they did not experience their ADHD symptoms anymore. And we call them remittent ADHD. So when these individuals came in the lab, when they were 21 years old, we took some blood and we extracted DNA from that. And we measured the DNA methylation throughout the whole code, the whole DNA code. And when we compared these DNA methylation patterns, we saw that persistent or individuals with persistent ADHD have more DNA methylation than individuals with remittent ADHD in a very specific part of the DNA. And this specific part regulates the protein ApoB. And ApoB is a protein that is needed to transfer cholesterol throughout our body. And you might know cholesterol as really unhealthy fat that is in all the cakes I love to make and eat. But we also need tiny amounts of cholesterol for our brain to function properly, because our brain cells, our neurons, are made also of cholesterol. So what we think is that individuals with persistent ADHD have a difference in their fat metabolism, causing their brain to function maybe a little bit different. And my general conclusion would be that DNA methylation is a very exciting biological mechanism that we can study to better understand diseases. And if we better understand the disease, then we might be closer to treatment and curing them. And that's what I wanted to share with you today.
Thank you very much, Mandy. Very interesting. And I love your analogy with the cakes. I'm looking for, I want a cake now. I have a beer, but I want a cake now. Yeah, so you say something about smoking. And I think many of us, we've all been told not to smoke, but no one said don't smoke because you might get, I don't know, can you get ADHD from smoking, or is that now, am I drawing conclusions now that I shouldn't?
No, so this is indeed one step too far. So smoking is a risk factor for getting ADHD, and then especially prenatal smoking. So when a mother is pregnant and smokes, and in this way expose the child to the smoking, but it's a risk factor. It doesn't mean that if your mother smoked, you have ADHD. And also it's not so clear-cut. If your mother did smoke and now you have ADHD, it's the fault of your mother. It doesn't work like that. It's not your fault having a disorder or disease like this, but it increases the risk of getting it. So it's healthier not to smoke, not only for ADHD, of course.
Yeah, okay. So there's links, but yeah, it's just one piece of the puzzle, basically, right?
Yes.
Causing it. Yes. I also see there's a question from Yevyen, if I pronounce that correctly, about who's a fellow cake lover. That's great. So how did you assess ADHD in children and adults? Do you assess that in the same way, or do you use a different method for that?
Yes, so it's a good question. There are questionnaires used that are asked. And so for the adults, they fill out these questions themselves. But for the children, these questionnaires are filled out by the parents. So it's a slightly different method of, but it's good to mention. So actually I left it out in this slide, but in between they came another time. So when they were 17, so close to adulthood, but still getting the child questionnaire filled out by the parents. So we also use this information to select remittent, persistent on.
Yeah. Okay. So it's through questions and interviews and.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And do they have the same symptoms? Is it the same symptoms in children and adults? Is there a difference between that?
Yeah. So in general, what you see is that the hyperactivity symptoms decrease. So there's less hyperactivity and impulsivity, and that the inattentive symptoms increase. In general, is what you see in patients with ADHD.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we can imagine that, right? If you know adults with ADHD, they're not so hyperactive as maybe your stereotypical child with ADHD, but they still have a little bit more of the inattention problems. Yes. Another question. Any idea about the most influential external factors that affect our cell methylation level other than smoking? And also cool results. I think that's a nice compliment for you. So what else can influence methylation?
Yes, so one thing that is now on the top of my mind, where a lot of research is being performed in this field, is stress. Stress is a really important environmental factor also for the development of mental disorders and psychiatric disorders. So, and here, there are a lot of studies showing that stress indeed alters your DNA methylation. But this field in science is relatively new, so we are exploring what is affecting.
I was going to ask, what about diet?
Yeah, so there are a lot of studies into diet, indeed. Also here, as Babette already explained, the effect sizes are often really small. So you need large sample sizes. And this is what the research field is currently still a bit lacking, these large sample sizes. So conclusions are drawn on small sample sizes, and then the question is this a real result, or is there not a difference, or did they not include enough people? Or so, I think in the coming years we will learn a lot about these external factors that influence our DNA methylation.
So again, we can also not do a DNA or a DNA methylation screen to diagnose someone with ADHD. It's all parts of a puzzle. It's very complex, yes, and there's a lot of variation also between people. But that's why we're doing this show tonight, to tell all the things that we don't know yet about ADHD, but that we're trying to unravel. And Mandy, do you know? Can you also, if you have this like more methylation or too little methylation, can you change that back? Can you take some drugs or to reverse the effects?
So I would not go for drugs immediately, but what we do know for smoking is that when you quit smoking, your DNA methylation restores to normal levels of a non-smoker. Not completely, I think, but it's reversible. So even quitting the bad habit could already be enough.
So if anyone here is trying to quit smoking and needs another argument, we have another one for you. Let's see. Do I have any other questions?
So actually, I have a question for Mirjam.
Yeah,
if that is still allowed.
Of course.
So I was wondering, because you have these feces donor banks, so people donating their poo for people with inflammatory bowel disease, for example, and these donors need to be physically healthy. But do you think that they maybe also need to be mentally healthy to be allowed to donate their gut microbiome?
At this point, I'm not sure whether this is part of the screening criteria, but indeed, this is something that may be relevant because we know also from studies in mice that if you transfer the fecal material from a mouse with, so these are suboptimal models, obviously, but if you transfer poo from a mouse that has ADHD symptoms or that is stressed, for example, if you transfer this poo into a mouth that was previously fine, it starts to exhibit also these symptoms. So this is indeed relevant, and I'm not sure at this point whether this is part of the criteria. But yeah, maybe in the future this will be changed, and also in the future, I think that there will be efforts made to make the filtering more, to optimize the filtering, because we don't know exactly what in the poo is the magic ingredient. So ideally, you would want to filter out all pathogenic bacteria, or all viruses, or all bacteria that may have a negative effect. But yeah, we don't understand enough of the effect to know which part of the poo we have to transfer, or to even revert to a more clean method than poo. So yeah, a relevant question.
Yeah, so this is now done for people who have, for instance, very severe bowel diseases, right? That's who they can get a fecal transplant, or a poo transfer, basically, from a healthy donor.
Because if you have, for example, a very aggressive intestinal infection, and then, for example, you have an overgrowth of a particular bacterium called Clostridium difficile, what is often done in case of an infection is that you are treated with antibiotics. But in this case, the function of antibiotics is actually that it's antibacterial. So it kills a lot of bacteria in your gut. And this gives room for other bacteria to grow where previously good bacteria, or commensal, how they're called, where previously commensal bacteria were. So antibiotics will not work if you have a completely overgrown gut with a pathogenic bacteria. So this is where the only option then is to bring in more and healthy bacteria from a donor, and they can grow and make the gut more, make the gut healthy again. So this is then the only way to treat this. So it's quite cool that this exists. But it exists only for intestinal disorders that would otherwise be untreatable. And on other occasions, it's not ethical to give fecal material, because it can also contain pathogens, right? But I was just explaining that we don't know exactly what it is in the poo that does the magic. So we cannot, as yet, give fecal material to subjects that have a mental problem, or that have a neurodevelopmental disorder. This is still under development. But
at least in mice, we know that this is, of course, very different, but that they change their behavior if they get it.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Do you still have any, while we are waiting maybe for a final question on the comments, we have maybe in the last 2 minutes, any burning questions, you can ask them now. I don't know if you still have questions for each other.
No, I was already asking about the diet, the effect of diet on methylation, and my question was already answered. I do wonder whether in bacteria it also works like this. I should definitely look this up. I'm not aware of this. Right?
Oh, we're getting new research questions already. Well,
yes.
So what I do know is that some bacteria can be methyl donors, to actually give the methyl group to attach to the DNA.
The human DNA?
Yes, but that's the question basically. But they can come in the bloodstream, so they must be able to reach DNA. But so this is well, interesting to look into.
Yeah. And that way also infections can methylate actually, which would also lead to a differential behavior. And what we see often in infections actually that leads to a different cognitive performance, right?
In which case?
Sorry, what did you say, Mirjam? I didn't hear.
I didn't completely understand, Babette. When does this happen?
For example, in infections, when you have an infection and bacteria is in your blood, obviously that could also be a way of altering your cognitive performance. Yeah. And not only through the immune system or more long-term probably if it is a methylation thing. That's a more long-term effect.
This starts sounding more like the zombie apocalypse any minute now. Maybe I'll give a short recap of what we've talked in case anyone now is getting lost in our scientific discussions about zombies. So Babette told us about kind of the unknown aspects of ADHD. On the one hand, emotional problems, but on the other hand, also creativity. And Mirjam told us about the bacteria in our gut that through different routes can influence our brain and also our mental health. And in the case of ADHD, there's some evidence that through producing substances that then are converted into dopamine and other signaling molecules in our brain, they can actually influence how our brain works. And then Mandy told us about these methyl groups that attach to our DNA and can switch our genes on and off, which on the one hand is good because then it can differentiate our bone and our heart cells, but sometimes it can also be less beneficial in case of, for instance, smoking, and it can be more harmful. Well, I learned a lot tonight. I hope everyone watching tonight also enjoy this. If you like this, and especially if you want to know more about these gut bacteria, then tomorrow we have another online event, again at 8 on the same channels on YouTube and Facebook. And then 2 researchers will tell you about how the gut communicates with cancer. This is a whole new topic. So not the brain, but with cancer cells. But still these awesome bacteria in our gut that are so important. And if you can't make it tomorrow, no problem, because next week we're here again with 5 other episodes. So Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Wednesday, Thursday, Friday next week, we also have episodes on various topics, from microplastics to AI, and I forgot the rest, but look at our website or on our social media to see what's happening. Thank you very much for being here tonight. So I already have this awesome Pint of Science glass, but you will also get one, and then we can cheers. Thank you also for showing us your bar, Mirjam.
Yes.
I still, even though we can't have this event live in a bar, it was nice to at least feel a little bit in the bar. And hopefully next year we can all meet again with a real Pint of Science. Oh, and if anyone, because of course this is an international event, so there's also things happening in other countries, but everyone's online, so actually you can binge watch next week, all week, other international events about science. So you do not have to be bored next week. Thank you very much, and see you another time. Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Cheers.